good morning and good afternoon to all of our guests in the virtual room, as well as those watching this streaming online. I'm Sarah Morgan with the International Labor Organization's Office for the United States and Canada. And we are so pleased all of you could join us today as we commemorate World Day Against Child Labor. I want to extend my particular thanks to our co-hosts for today's event at the U.S. Department of Labor's Bureau of International Labor Affairs, or ILAB. ILAB has been an invaluable partner for the ILO in working together to combat child labor and forced labor globally for over 2.5 decades, and we greatly value their support and partnership. Partnership with ILAB, with other governments, workers, employers, and others, is all the more important now as we are at a pivotal moment in the fight against child labor. As you all know, last year, the ILO and UNICEF released updated estimates that showed global progress against child labor has stalled for the first time since we began producing global estimates 2 decades ago. The most recent estimates showed the number of children in child labor has risen to 160 million worldwide, an increase of 8.4 million children over our last estimates. And this is the first increase in 2 decades. These trends were present even before the COVID-19 crisis. And without mitigation strategies, child labor could continue to rise due to higher poverty and increased vulnerability. But this is not inevitable. The actual impact will depend in large part on policy responses. To that end, we've seen the huge influence social protection coverage has on child labor. Where social protection coverage is allowed to slip, a significant further increase in child labor could occur. A rise in social protection coverage, on the other hand, could more than offset the impact of COVID-19 on child labor, returning us to progress on this issue. Which is why this year we're focusing on highlighting and further exploring how social protection contributes to reducing child labor. I'm looking forward to the discussion today and to continuing to work with all of you going forward. Now, I'm very pleased to introduce our co-host and moderator for today's discussion, Deputy Undersecretary for International Labor Affairs, Thea Lee. Deputy Undersecretary Lee joined ILAB just over a year ago now. She has been a tireless advocate for workers' rights, both domestically and internationally, for over 30 years, including as president of the Economic Policy Institute, as well as in a number of senior positions at the AFL-CIO. Deputy Undersecretary Lee, we're so pleased to have the opportunity to work with you and ILAB. Thank you very much for your leadership and partnership. And without further ado, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Sarah, and delighted to have you open today's event, and many, many thanks to the ILO for co-hosting this event today with the U.S. Labor Department. It is a tremendous pleasure to be here today as we commemorate the World Day Against Child Labor. It is especially timely that we are meeting following the 5th Global Conference on the Elimination of Child Labor, which took place 2 weeks ago in Durban, South Africa. I had the pleasure of attending the conference and seeing the level of engagement and focus brought to these issues from all around the world. And we really wanted to congratulate also the South African government for the tremendous hospitality and leadership that they displayed hosting this great conference. We've also had some very important and fruitful discussions recently with our other global leaders at the G7 on addressing labor exploitation in our global supply chains and deepening our commitment to using every tool at our disposal to end child labor, including the EU's exploration of mandatory due diligence and the US focus on using market access and trade policy more effectively to change the economic calculus for both corporations and governments. We need to build on this momentum. We know the root causes of child labor: poverty, inequality, inadequate social safety nets, little respect for enforcement of labor laws. And we also have good evidence on what works to address child labor. We know that when parents and caregivers have decent work, they are less likely to rely on their children to put food on the table. Parents need the opportunity to organize freely, to bargain collectively, and to advocate for their interests, both in the political system and at the workplace. When companies step up with more transparency and due diligence throughout their supply chains, they can identify, address, and mitigate the risk of child and forced labor in their products. When children have access to education, they can gain the skills and knowledge to reach their potential, rather than repeating the cycle of poverty and child labor. And the focus of today's event, when families have the support of robust social protection systems, they can withstand shocks without relying on their children's labor. These are all priorities we are working on at iLab, alongside our ongoing work with governments around the globe to strengthen protections for workers and children. Now is the time to act together on these solutions on a global scale. Each of you here today has a role to play, and I thank all of you for your participation today. I would like now to introduce some remarks from U.S. Secretary of Labor, Marty Walsh, who is working every day, morning, noon, and night, to build an economy that works for all of us, especially working families and children who are in child labor or at risk of child labor. Secretary Walsh has been a lifelong champion of equity and for working families. He has been a leading voice for workers everywhere, from his role in the building trades unions to mayor of Boston. And now, as Secretary of Labor, he has continued this work. He is a global leader in the fight to end child and forced labor. Secretary Walsh, thank you for joining us today.
It's an honor to join you today to commemorate World Day Against Child Labor. A special thank you to the ILO Washington office and the Department of Labor's iLab for organizing this event. 2022 marks 20 years since the global community first came together for World Day Against Child Labor. But after 20 years of progress reducing global child labor, we are now at a standstill. 160 million children are engaged in child labor. It's a denial of fundamental human and labor rights, and it's unacceptable. Last month, I spoke at the 5th Global Conference on the Elimination of Child Labor. I urge global leaders to double down on our efforts to eliminate child labor and forced labor. Ending child labor requires more than just pulling exploited kids out of work. It means standing up for workers' rights to organize and bargain for family-sustaining wages and benefits. We must empower workers to reject exploitative and dangerous work conditions and advocate for better ones. The Biden-Harris administration is working to advance the rights of workers around the world. We are prioritizing the enforcement of labor laws, expanding social protection programs, fighting discrimination, and advancing gender and racial equity. And we are lifting up those who lead in this fight. Each year, the Department of Labor gives the Iqbal Masih Award for the elimination of child labor. The award recognizes an individual or organization whose contributions have been extraordinary. It's my honor to announce that this year, the department is recognizing Blue Dragon Children's Foundation. Blue Dragon Children's Foundation has been working to end human trafficking in Vietnam for nearly 20 years. The organization stands out as a leader in supporting trafficking survivors. They partner with government and create safe spaces for the country's most vulnerable youth. Blue Dragon has rescued over 1,000 children and adults from human trafficking and has sent nearly 6,000 children back to school and job training. We are fortunate to have several others inspiring speakers today. They will highlight their work on social protection as a key element in the fight to eliminate child labor. Once again, I thank you for observing this year's World Day Against Child Labor and invite you to join me in building a more just workforce and a brighter future for our world's children. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Secretary Walsh. We are honored to have you with us today. And I'd like to add my congratulations to our 2022 Iqbal Masih Award winner, Blue Dragon Children's Foundation. At the end of today's program, you will have the opportunity to see some artwork from children participating in Blue Dragon's programs. At iLab, we are truly inspired by their work to combat the worst forms of child labor and create safe spaces and opportunities for survivors of trafficking. As Secretary Walsh said, they are true leaders in this effort. I want to turn now to the theme of today's discussion, social protection. We have seen the pandemic send countless families deeper into poverty and push more children into child labor. Others are now more at risk of child labor than ever before. this does not have to be the case. When families have access to social supports, from birth registrations to unemployment benefits to in-kind food or cash programs, they are much less likely to resort to child labor to weather a crisis, such as a lost job, a health setback, an economic shock, or a climate crisis. Unfortunately, in too many countries, these services fall short or are absent. People already at the margins, because of race, gender, class, disability, or other status, often face higher barriers to accessing these vital services. We need governments to step up with robust social protection systems that increase resilience and reduce poverty and inequality. I'm deeply honored today to share the virtual stage with 4 leaders in the fight to end child labor and expand social protection. I look forward to discussing with them where social protection is having an impact in reducing child labor and where more work is needed to reach at-risk families. I will introduce our panelists and ask each of them to provide some brief opening remarks before we delve deeper into the discussion. First, I want to introduce Mr. Linton Makunu, the Acting Director General of the National Department of Social Development of South Africa. He served as the Chief of Staff heading the Ministry of Social Development, as well as the Ministry of Small Business Development. At the Department of Social Development, he leads the development and implementation of a developmental social policy program and leads efforts to promote children's rights, including overseeing the drafting of the Children's Act Amendment Bill. And of course, as we said earlier, South Africa was the site of the 5th Global Conference on the Elimination of Child Labor just a couple of weeks ago. Welcome, Director General. Next, I would like to welcome Ms. Shahra Wazabi, Director of the Social Protection Department at the International Labor Organization. Shahra is a development economist with more than 25 years of experience working on social policy, social protection, gender, and development. Shahra, we are honored to have you here today. Our next panelist is Ms. Allison Tate, the Director of Economic and Social Policy of the International Trade Union Confederation. She is an economist and has experience in national and global policy areas across several domains, including economics, international trade and investment, social policy, human and trade union rights, and sustainable development. She has worked with global brands, employers, and governments on the global call to action in the garment sector on the impact of COVID-19, including the social protection needs of workers in 8 countries. Allison, welcome to the panel. And last but not least, let me introduce Jeremiah Palamba. Jeremiah is an advisor at the Strategy, Policy, and Review Department of the International Monetary Fund in Washington, D.C. In his work, he covers topics such as social spending and inclusion and macroeconomic policy. He has worked on several low-income and emerging market countries, as well as advanced economies, including Namibia, Eswatini, the Gambia, Peru, El Salvador, and Greece. Prior to joining the IMF, Jeremiah also worked as a minister advisor at the Italian Ministry of Economy and at the World Bank and in academia. Jeremiah, thank you also for joining us. Shahra, let me start with you to set the stage. What does the existing evidence tell us about the relationship between social protection and child labor, and how can countries take effective action?
Well, hello, good morning, good afternoon. Thank you, Thea, for that question. And also great, I want to thank the iLab at Department of Labor for their invitation to be part of this panel. And it's really great to be with all of you today, and particularly also my distinguished panelists here. So I think, the resounding message from the research that we have is that social protection is an really indispensable tool to ensure children's well-being, and also a very effective policy approach to fight child labor. However, as we know very well, there's too little progress that has been made in making sure that all children really enjoy social protection. The fact that in this particular 3rd decade of the 21st century, the vast majority of children, about 1.5 billion today, between the ages of 0 and 14, still receive no form of child and family cash benefit, I think is a really a moral, a social, as well as economic catastrophe. And many of these children are the ones who are in child labor. We really urgently need to do something about building the social protection system for children. So how do we do this? Let me highlight very briefly, two policy messages that I really would like to get across to you now, and hope to hear a bit more from the others as we engage in a conversation. Firstly, I think it's really important to close the social protection coverage gap for children. What does this mean? It really means prioritizing implementation of child benefits. And this can be achieved very effectively by having quasi-universal or universal child benefits that can really ensure that all children are covered. We have evidence from countries that have already had a universal child benefits for a long time, which shows that universal benefits achieve much greater poverty reduction compared to child benefits that are means tested or targeted to only particular groups of children. And also in countries that currently are without a universal child benefit, we have done simulations which show that a universal child benefit scheme that costs just about 1% of GDP would actually be quite effective in reducing child poverty rates by as much as 20%, which has a significant implications, of course, for child labor, which alone is a very good reason for making policymakers consider putting in place a universal child benefit scheme. It also means extending social protection to the 2 billion or more workers who are in the informal economy, which really supports them transitioning to the formal economy. And you may ask, why is that effective for child labor? Of course, it's critical given that children, don't live on their own very often. They live in families with parents, with caregivers. And very often when these caregivers are working in the informal economy settings, that's where also you have very high rates of child labor because the parents also have no access to social protection. So extending social protection to the informal economy workers will be very important to reduce the kind of vulnerabilities that drive child labor as parents resort to this as a desperation strategy. Now, second point, very briefly, we really need to build integrated social protection systems. The evidence that we have shows very clearly that the impact of social protection measures is even greater when you have child benefits complemented by other kind of life cycle benefits, where you have integrated systems, as we call it, which provide social protection across the life cycle to people in their working age, to older people having maternity benefits, unemployment benefits, the full range of social protection benefits. And when you have these systems and they provide adequate levels of benefits and are inclusive and particularly sensitive to the needs of women who are very often both caregivers and wage workers and income earners, then you can really get a much bigger impact. Building these integrated systems, of course, also means that we need to capitalize on the strong political commitments that already exist to end child labor, and also political commitments to make social protection a universal right for everyone. I hope I can elaborate a bit more on some of the other issues later. Thank you, Thea.
Thank you, Shafra. That was tremendous. Really concise, but also really substantive. And I think those messages, I think part of what we hear is that it is not just the right thing to do, but it's also economically efficient to protect, to create these kinds of social protection systems that are quasi or universal, that that extend into the informal economy and that are integrated with other programs. But this actually saves money and certainly increases the productivity of the society going forward. So thank you so much, Shafra. I hope we will come back to some of those points. Next, I would like to turn to Director General Makunu and ask you to describe what South Africa is doing in terms of social protection initiatives to discourage child labor and any successes that could be replicated. Director General, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the opportunity. And I greet you from South Africa. I actually greet you in the middle of what we call the Child Protection Week, where we, as a department, together with the country and the whole and various stakeholders, highlight the work that we're doing around the care and protection of children. So we're very grateful to be part of this discussion, but also I must appreciate the ILO for having partnered with us under the leadership of President Cyril Ramaphosa in hosting the 5th Global Conference on the Elimination of Child Labor just a few days ago. So in South Africa, child protection is key at reducing vulnerabilities and empowers communities, ensuring that children attend and remain in school and parents have the income to sustain their development and their education without resorting to child labor to supplement household income. So as a country, we've adopted a comprehensive approach to discourage child labor. Our constitution protects the rights of children, and our government has implemented various legislation provisions that ensure that children are protected and discouraged from child labor. For example, in Section 28, we focus on the rights of children, and so the expanded scope of social protection is to discourage rather child labor, includes but is not limited to our social protection program, which is one of the biggest social protection programs in our country, but also globally in the world, and currently reaching over 18.5 million beneficiaries for eligible children and elderly and persons with disability. The child support grant in itself reaches just over 13 million children below the ages of 18, and the child support grant contributes to several positive outcomes on children, prolonging their stay in schools and thus ensuring that they are not exposed to early entry into the labor market, and of course to ensure that we could provide a greater income support for orphans in the care of their relatives. Government has just gazetted just 2 days ago a proclamation of the Social Assistance Act and its regulations. Now, during COVID-19, it's important to just highlight that our government implemented a short-term social child support grant top-up amount and ensure that caregivers also accessed what we call the COVID-19 Social Relief of Distress grant. And by the end of March, we'd paid just over 10.5 million beneficiaries. But further, we provide access to free basic services such as shelter, water, sanitation, and energy for poor households. We also provide free education in schools in poor quintiles. This is accompanied by a school nutrition program and a transport program. The National School Nutrition Program currently provides meals to over 9 million children. And during the national lockdown, our community nutrition and development centers were kept open to ensure that children are able to get food and families are able to get food from there. So this is, of course, notwithstanding the challenges that we have around the number of child-headed households, and we're providing measures in order to address that. And then we also provide free healthcare for children under 6, and the country has completed piloting a national health insurance, meaning that we will soon be able to implement a health insurance to cover parents when they are unable to work, and thus removing the potential responsibility and burden falling on children. And then lastly, we believe that having strong enabling integrated policies is key. And for instance, we've just launched a comprehensive child protection policy as well as a social assistance act to facilitate provision of these relief interventions. And of course, we are assuming a developmental social welfare approach, which is a focus on individuals, families, and communities. This enables us as a state to provide short-term relief funds for major disasters such as fires, floods, etc. And this is a non-contributory and means-tested, targeting largely the poor. I'd leave it at that.
Thank you so much, Director General. And it does, that's very impressive list of policies. And it sounds like you all are incorporating a lot of lessons that Shahra talked about in the overall terms around quasi-universal or universal, and also the integration of other social services. So thank you so much for those remarks. And I hope we'll come back to some of those themes in the next round of questions. Next, I'd like to turn to Alison Tate with the ITUC. We know that workers and unions have a huge role to play in efforts to combat both child labor and forced labor. And at iLab, we are very focused on empowering workers so they can advance better workplaces and wages. What is your perspective on the relationship between working conditions and child labor? And how is the ITUC, the International Trade Union Confederation, addressing this? Alison?
Thank you for having us here. Well, what we need to really do is to ensure that we identify and are well aware of the multiplicity of factors that lead to child labor. Trade unions are active on many levels of representing workers, campaigning for better conditions, and advocating with governments. We have seen that it is the most vulnerable children living in poverty in rural areas, migrant workers who've had to leave home to seek work elsewhere, asylum seekers, and refugees. They are the most mainly exposed to child labor, those children and their families. So we see that a vast majority of child labor is found in the sectors where we register the highest levels of informality. Shahra has already spoken about that. not just globally, we see that more than 93% of agricultural workers, for example, at a global level are informal, not covered by labor laws. So the coverage of labor law and the registration of businesses as a way to formalize informal work is essential. Labor inspection is often non-existent in the areas where child labor is common. Decent work is not a reality for working age adults. So fundamental rights are denied, and wages and income and working conditions are insufficient, in fact, dismal. So therefore, we call for targeted but holistic approaches from governments to promote inclusive policies that ensure the promotion and the realization of decent work. And that covers a few things. So I want to just take a moment to outline those, because it's actually through the eradication of, for example, piece rate payments in favor of statutory minimum living wages and negotiated decent wages, fostering the transition from the informal to the formal economy, expanding the scope as well as access to and the quality of services provided by governments, such as accessible and quality healthcare and education. So in summary, Thea, there are actually three areas that we think are important. One is employment, jobs, decent work for parents. Two, universal social protection, so that at the level of personal shocks, whether they be health or economic or climate or others, when individuals are impacted, we need to see universal social protection supported to address those individuals, shocks to individuals' lives and disruptions, and to family dignity, to national shocks, and to global shocks. And then thirdly, it's quality public education, indeed universal public education. They're the three things that we know make a difference.
Thank you so much, Alison. That's great. And I think we're really starting to hear a lot of the same themes here, and we can pull them all together between the work that the International Union Confederation is doing, along with the ILO and the other organizations. Next, I would like to turn to Jeremiah Palumba. We know that financing for social protection systems is a huge issue in several countries. Could you talk to us about why the IMF sees social spending as such an important area for investment, and describe the IMF's approach to social spending?
Hi, Thea. First of all, thank you very much for inviting me to participate to this panel discussion. Now, while the IMF does not directly deal with child labor, social spending and gender inclusion issue are an important part of the IMF work. And as we heard from previous panelists, social spending does matter to reduce the phenomenon of child labor. Now, to explain why social spending matters to the IMF work and what approach we have on this issue, let me look a moment to what is the IMF mandate here. Broadly speaking, the IMF mandate is to preserve macroeconomic and financial stability. This includes preserving external stability, but also means preserving domestic stability, which, among other issues, include preserving fiscal sustainability and fostering inclusive growth. Now, why is social spending relevant from a macroeconomic point of view, for the IMF work from this point of view? The answer is quite simple. Like, social spending and gender inclusion issue are key to foster inclusive growth and therefore to preserve macroeconomic stability, which is the IMF mandate. And so for this reason, we look at this issue as part of our core mandate. Now, these are not just like abstract statement. These are real concern in our membership. Our membership is de facto almost 200 countries. For example, in 2021, we ran a survey with our members, and policymakers listed inequality among the top 3 policy priorities, just after growth and debt. And then there was inequality in the top 3. These are also our concern, and each time the social spending is considered macro-critical, is part of our analysis. Currently, for example, just to give you an idea, we currently cover inclusion issue in about 50 countries per year, see what we call our surveillance activity, which are basically macroeconomic checks that we run for each of our country, any country, from the US to the sub-Saharan country. The IMF also provide loans to country in the context of fund-supported programs. Now, let me just clarify. These loans help country to deal with balance of payment problems, not to finance public projects. But social spending issues are a core part of fund-supported program. And typically programs include floors on to protect or to actually increase social spending during a phase of adjustment. Currently, 90% of our programs to low-income countries have such floor on social spending. Just to give you a practical example, let's look at one of our largest programs that we did in 2022 with Ecuador. In that case, the conditionality associated with the program included increasing the number of people covered by the safety net and upgrading the social registry. These are, of course, like measures that allow us to support the most vulnerable during a crisis. Ecuador was in the 2019 to 20 had a lot of macroeconomic pressures. Now, the bottom line here is basically that social spending issue are critical from a macroeconomic point of view to guarantee macro stabilities in countries. And at IMF, we do look at social spending issue because we find them when they're macro critical. And then when we lend to countries, usually as part of our program, we pay attention and we try to assure that social spending is preserved if it's not actually increased, which is like a feature that we are observing in the latest programs, say during the pandemic and we can define post-pandemic programs. Thanks.
So much, Jeremiah. And I think this is really interesting. And it also, I mean, is it fair to say that there has been a shift in the thinking of the IMF in terms of the importance of social spending, and that maybe that shift is focused on the research, the empirical research that you have done amongst member countries?
Sorry, I could not hear precisely the question.
Sorry. What I wanted to ask was whether this new focus, the IMF's focus on social spending as an important piece of macroeconomic stability, as well as fostering inclusive economic growth, is a little bit new for the IMF. That the IMF, in the olden days used to be more focused on austerity and budget deficits, and there has been a shift, but maybe that shift has been because of a change in what the economic research has shown.
Well, it's new and actually it's not new. It's part of our requirement when we lend to low-income countries that we do need to protect social spending. Now, in 2019, we actually issue a strategy on how we should deal with social spending issues, both when we do surveillance, when de facto we have a macroeconomic discussion with country, and when we do lending. And we are expanding on that analysis. Now, the pandemic is clearly made very clear that there are shortcomings in the safety net in country, and these are relevant to deal with macroeconomic shocks. So yes, this is obviously part of our mandate at this point, and it's seen this way. So the IMF program are not just about fiscal adjustment, they're about something else too.
Thank you very much, Jeremiah. I want to turn back to Shafra. And returning to your previous remarks and keeping with the thread of financing. You talked about building universal social protection systems, but is this affordable for many countries, especially developing countries where we see so many child labor problems?
Well, I think that's a great question, Thea, and I hope that it also links nicely with what Jeremiah was just saying about the social spending floor. I mean, I think it's really no secret that closing the social protection gaps that we know are so big in many developing countries really requires filling the financing gap, as we say, because it's no secret that many of these gaps that we see in social protection systems, the fact that in so many countries, children don't have a child benefit, that there's no unemployment protection and so forth, really is because there is significant underinvestment in social protection systems, not enough spending, not enough social spending. And filling this financing gap is really a matter of urgency in many countries. If we want everyone to have access to social protection when they need it, which is what universal social protection is about. Now, currently in low and middle income countries, we have, the estimates, and it's all in the World Social Protection Report. I don't want to take up time to give you numbers, but those countries are spending very little as a share of GDP on social protection for children, even though in low and middle income countries, children make up, relatively speaking, a bigger proportion of the population. But the spending on child benefits is very, very low. And our estimates also suggest, and these are estimates we did just after the COVID crisis, that looking only at low income countries, you would need about 77.9 billion US dollars. This is billion with a B, right? Per year, in order to be able to ensure what we call a social protection floor for everyone. And that includes child benefits. To put this in perspective, 77.9, let's say 78 billion is a lot of money. But just to put this in perspective, in the context of the COVID crisis, almost 19 trillion was mobilized in the global fiscal stimulus response to the pandemic. So we're talking here about billions, a smaller amount. And efforts to really close this financing gap should progressively, start by securing domestic resources. And if and when it's necessary, supplement the domestic resources which you can get through social contribution systems, through progressive forms of taxation. You can supplement that in context very low income countries with international support and better public financing and debt management, which is a big issue for many low income countries who are servicing their debts and spending more on debt servicing than they are investing in their social protection systems and public services. And let me just add one really, I think, important point, which is that we really need to understand that countries don't build a social protection system after they develop. They build a social protection system in order to develop. This is really the lesson from some of the Nordic countries historically, which had, emerged from wars, had war-torn societies, and used social protection to build up their economies and societies. Because social protection is the engine of development, and it really facilitates the kind of structural transformations that you need in an economy, as well as really investing in human capabilities, which is the most important resource that any economy has. So failure to build and invest in social protection system for children by any means is very irrational, as you said, it really does deprive societies of economic and social prosperity and progress. And investing in social protection not only assures that children's rights are met, but it also really plays a very important role to create that kind of virtual cycle of development, which involves, transitioning to more formal forms of work and really getting the economic engine going. And here formalization, as Alison was saying, is a critical step to build a kind of sustainable tax and transfer system. Because once you formalize your enterprises and enterprises are paying taxes and you have social security contributions from workers and employers, you're much better able to finance your social protection system and build the kind of national infrastructure and human capabilities that are all conditions that are conducive to eliminate child labor and achieve even more than that. And really what we say is that all countries have scope for domestic resource mobilization to progressively invest in reinforcing their social protection system for children. And it's important that they do that and they build the social protection floor for the life cycle risks that we all face. We're all vulnerable. It's not just the very, very poor. Everyone, as we saw it during this crisis, vulnerability doesn't just happen to a very specific sector of people that you can identify, Poverty is a very dynamic thing, and vulnerability is very dynamic. That's why you need a universal system that can really protect everyone and build that kind of solidarity that we need in our societies. So let me stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Shahra. That was a tremendous answer, and you really covered a lot of ground, a lot of points that I think are really important. I mean, one of them, just to start at the end, is that this isn't just a poor country problem. This is a rich country and a middle-income country and a poor country. That we all, especially during the pandemic, saw that the vulnerability of certain segments of population is in many ways a threat to the whole economy and the whole society. But I think the other point that you made in terms of, can a poor country, a developing country, afford a universal social protection system? I think what I heard you saying is they can't afford not to have one, because this is the essential building block to the kind of virtuous cycle of transitioning away, as Allison said, from informality to a formal sector, so that you have the resources, the ability to tax. And this is where I think I'm going to come back to the IMF, to Jeremiah at this point, because it's so important that I'm really happy to see both the ILO and the IMF together, united on many of these points, because one of the things that developing countries need is the assurances from the international financial institutions like the IMF and the World Bank that they can and they must, have the revenue systems in place to be able to fund these social protection systems, and that without that they are actually making economically bad decisions. So, Jeremy, I want to turn back to you. We've seen that people who are already on the margins become more vulnerable to poverty and child labor during the pandemic. What has the IMF been doing to safeguard social spending, particularly for vulnerable populations during times of crisis and emergency like the pandemic?
Well, this is actually a very interesting question, because during economic crisis, emergency, the IMF is typically called to deploy the maximum of its financial support to stabilize the economy. But crises are also the times when it's important to safeguard social spending and protect vulnerable people, because there is the moment that the vulnerable people increases and there are pressure on social spending. Now, let me go back a bit to the macro point of view that we use at the IMF. What happened during the pandemic from a macroeconomic point of view? So the pandemic led to an unprecedented economic shock. It created external imbalances to most of the country, but it also put government budget under pressure. The fiscal revenue started declining, while government had to increase the spending to finance health and to protect the most vulnerable people that were coming under pressure, losing jobs. Now, there were some categories that we understood exposed, that were more exposed to this type of shocks, including women, low-paid workers, children, the poor. The economic shock and the impact on this category was huge. But it's not just about the pandemic, I have to say. If we look to the recent increase in food and oil prices, I mean, these increases are putting further pressure on this category and on the budget of country. Now, to come to your question, how did the IMF react to the pandemic, and how we try to safeguard social spending during this period? Now, the fund had taken like a multi-pronged approach during this period. As I have to say, we deployed a sort of an unprecedented financial support. So as a first step, in the first months of the pandemic, the IMF provided a lot of emergency financing, more than 30 billion to almost 80 countries. This was done in a very, in record time. It was for us an unprecedented effort. We never done so much of emergency financing. Now, this emergency financing comes with no conditions. The idea here, it was just to provide financial resources to country to deal with the shock that they were facing, and with the idea that they could use this money for budgets as a budget support. So de facto to pay for health spending and for rising social spending needs. Now, what happened is the country did use IMF emergency financing to finance health and an expansion of social spending. What we observed exposed is that this helped not just to protect social spending, but actually social spending increased across the membership. Now, as a second element, the IMF did issue what we an SDR allocation to member country. This was about $650 billion. Now, what is an SDR allocation? It's a bit more sort of technical. Now, the SDR allocation is an asset created by the fund, and it usually is put in the international reserves, but it's also create policy space. How this happens? The country can exchange the SDR against proper currency, like US dollars. And so country did actually convert the SDR in other currency, and they start using this currency to support their recovery and social spending in the last almost a year. In my experience, I review a lot of African countries. Most of them actually did convert part of the SDR allocation to support specific priority spending they had in mind. We also create a trust fund with this SDR allocation, which is expected to finance long-term to provide long-term loans to finance climate change reforms and pandemic preparedness in the future. We expect this to be operational by the end of this year. And then the IMF also provide debt reliefs, temporary debt reliefs, together with the G20. Now, this emergency support has been additional to the standard IMF program, and we recently have seen a surge in IMF-supported program. We already give you an example before about the Ecuador. If we come more recently, let me give you another couple of examples. Last year we started a program with Madagascar. There is an extremely poor country and a fragile country. Now, that program includes a floor on social spending and a target to increase the number of beneficiary of cash transfer programs. I mean, there's a specific number. Like in this operation, we usually rely on other institutions, as you mentioned before. It can be the ILO, it can be the World Bank, it can be the World Food Program. We have really strengthened our collaboration with this institution. And similarly, is our program with Senegal that we started in 2021, where the program has a floor on social spending. In this case, it's a percentage of total spending. So where we say, or your total spending, a certain percentage has to go to social spending, or your total spending. And we also put target on doubling the number of households included in the national registry from 500,000 in that case to 1 million. So to summarize, during the pandemic, the IMF support has relied on a lot of exceptional tools. And for us, from our point of view, has been unprecedented. And for what we observe, is actually has helped country to deal with the pandemic, to protect and invest more in social spending. This is what at this point we have seen, and we plan to go along this line for the next in the future.
Thank you so much, Jeremy, for that. And I think there's no question the IMF has some really important tools to use in this battle, and the special drawing rights, I know, were an essential source of liquidity for countries that were under budget stress, and also very much appreciate what you've done with floors. So the conditionality of IMF loans now is going to ensure adequate social spending. So thank you very much for that answer, Jeremy. I want to turn now to the future and to Director General Makunu, and what action we can take to move the needle on social protection and advance the fight to end child labor more generally. Director General Makunu, coming from just hosting the 5th Global Conference on Child Labor, what are some of the lessons that South Africa would like to share? And how do we take forward our shared commitments to eliminate child labor as well as forced labor and human trafficking?
Well, thank you very much, Program Director. Maybe just to touch on the point that my former speaker spoke to around countries having a specific focus and commitment towards social spending, social protection, and spending rather for social protection. Our government receives one of the largest budgets in the country in terms of the appropriations, and a bulk of this goes towards social protection. And a number of other departments are actually focusing on sort of various social protection measures, as I indicated earlier. But now back to the conference, I think one of the, I call it a legacy aspect that we've achieved, or that at least I believe we contributed towards this particular conference, is the level of child participation throughout the entire conference, and ensuring that the voices of children are heard loud and clear against child labor. And I suppose this is one of it's part of, or rather in line with an expression that we often use which is nothing about us without us. And I think in this context, we were able to ensure that the voice of children are actively heard. And so that when we co-create programs for children, we are able to do it with them, and they're part and parcel of that. And I think that's one of the important aspects that we would like to take forward coming out of this conference. Of course, the conference also adopted a 6-point plan, broadly referred to as the Durban Call to Action. And one of the action points is achieving universal access to social protection. And this is a call for us to, or rather was a call for us as policymakers to really ensure that social protection is at the center and at the heart of dealing with child labor. And through these efforts of implementing policies and legislation aligned to international instruments, we can eliminate child labor, including forced labor and human trafficking. And therefore, in this regard, we will use the conference tripartite model for advancing our efforts collectively. And we have learned a great deal that we can do more with other governments and other social partners, including business, labor, and civil society organizations, which had a really prominent role to play in the conference. So lastly, I think during the conference, Honorable Hamza Mohammed, who is the Child Ambassador and President of the Nelson Mandela Children's Parliament in South Africa, recorded that most children are the victims of child labor due to poverty, and poverty and lack of resources leads to frustration in children and leads them sometimes to committing crimes, leads into substance abuse and other violent acts. And his message is consistent with various inputs from other participants at the conference. The main lesson for us was that we need to incorporate issues raised to accelerate our joint interventions that directly address the challenges and underlying causes of child labor. So this aspect of collaboration is fundamental, and ensuring that we're able to address the fundamental challenge of poverty. And in our case, we like to call it the triple challenges, which is poverty, unemployment, and inequality. And I think those are important aspects when dealing with issues of child labor that we must take into consideration and finding ways and means to address them. So in conclusion, the use of information systems is also critical in monitoring progress in the elimination of child labor, including forced labor and related human trafficking. So we want to, when we get to the next conference in the next few years, to ensure that we are able to track the deliverables and outcomes of this conference in a very practical way, so that we are able to build from the previous conference that we just come out of. And we hope that going into the next conference, we'd have a strong sense of child participation as well. So thank you very much, Program Director.
Thank you, Director General Makuno. And I loved the children's participation in the South Africa conference in Durban. We had some really strong children's voices, and in the closing session, there was a really moving and really thoughtful presentation from one of the children who had been part of the discussions. And we're very proud of that. This is, as you say, a legacy of the 5th Global Conference to Eliminate Child Labor. And we thank South Africa for centering children and children's voices in that. And as you say, the Durban Call to Action there's a lot of work for all of us to do. And you know what I think none of us want is to be 4 years from now at the next global conference and to have the same, to be basically starting all over again. We really want to move forward. We want to take the steps we need to take with respect to social protection, with respect to supply chains, with respect to worker voice. So thank you again for your leadership and for your hosting of that important conference.
Thank you.
Last, I'm turning to Allison Tate to help wrap us up and to lend us your insight on the future and round out our discussion. What do you see, Allison, as the next steps for social protection and child labor, especially in light of the economic and social consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic? Allison?
Sorry. Even before COVID-19, before we were living with the pandemic of COVID-19 globally, which we still are, remember everybody, that the number of children at work was enormous. At the beginning of 2020, it was 1 in 10 children aged 5 and over were involved in child labor worldwide. That's equating to 160 million children. That's a population bigger than many countries. So what we see in the existing faults in the global economy that have been brutally exposed and exacerbated in the past 2 years, then the reconstruction and resilience policies must support tens of millions of child workers out of work and back into education, back to school, or into school in many cases. I also want to point out that the decreasing shares of labor income, despite the huge corporate profits made by some companies and some sectors during the pandemic, together with the continued failure to guarantee decent wages for adults across global supply chains, we will undo the progress that was made in terms of addressing poverty and inequality. And we will leave behind yet another generation of at-risk children. This is the world we face right now. So it is true that many governments have invested more in their social protection systems in response to the crisis. And our IMF colleagues shared about how international financial institutions have addressed the emergency financing. But what we know, as Shara was speaking about, if we are to invest in a global solution and to address the most vulnerable and the poorest countries, then we have to go beyond that. We have to look at long-term investments. So the international financial institutions actually provide, well, the World Bank actually provides 2/3 of ODA, Overseas Development Assistance, to social protection globally. But you know, back in, I'm just going to look at a number here because I don't remember these off the top of my head, but in 2020, the share of overseas development assistance to social protection increased to 2.7% of total ODA. That accounts for $5.6 billion US, up from a mere 1.3% in 2019. That's still way, way, way insufficient. So 2/3 of those funds came through through loans rather, to developing countries. So we are also facing, at the same time as enormous poverty and a food crisis globally, a climate crisis, and an underemployment or unemployment crisis in most countries, as well as informality, then we have to connect the dots on this. And social protection is not just a rights-based framework to do that, it is also a tool for all countries to invest in the future, to invest in our societies, to invest in local economies that work. And we have actually done research that shows not social protection as a basic safety net or cash transfer, but social protection that Shara was speaking about, where the ILO has expertise to provide advice to international institutions and governments about what social protection for building resilience looks like. And it's proven, oh, my lights just went off. It is proven that the economic returns is 2%. That's really important in this current global context. So in the context of addressing many countries taking on enormous debt and the debt repayments and rescheduling that needs to go on to actually provide debt relief or debt forgiveness for the poorest countries that are facing the most extreme issues in terms of poverty, we need to look at mechanisms that support global investment. And I'll just finish that, Thea, with 2 final points. One is that any global social protection fund, and it was in the questions and answers, so I'll try to address that question from one of the participants, that funding will certainly be required internationally, but it has to be based on national plans that prioritize local public policy priorities. And providing the fiscal space for countries in terms of debt elimination is so important. So that's about income support, child support, maternity provisions, etc. It's about income, health, and vital public services. And I just want to finish by quoting David Navarro, not the famous guitarist or the famous football player, but he's known as Mr. UN Ebola chief, actually. And at the World Economic Forum just recently, he said, social protection is not a socialist agenda. It's a business agenda. He was talking about why building resilience is so important, and that businesses cannot operate with that social protection floor if it's not supporting local workers and the local labor market and formalizing informal work. So I really think that the budget support, the SDR allocations, the policy space, and the national priorities, we have to actually have much more coherence that really looks at investing in the longer term and delivering both good impact in poverty alleviation, addressing unemployment, financing social protection. And that's, of course, what the global call to action in the Durban conference was all about. We need to work on that together. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Allison, for pulling it all together and connecting all the different pieces of today's program. And that is a wrap. I know we are just skimming the surface of this important topic. I look forward to working with all of our partners who are here today to strengthen social protection in our work moving forward. And I want to thank each of our 4 amazing panelists for lending us their time and their insight today. And a very sincere thanks to the ILO Washington office for co-hosting this important conversation with us. As we close out, I invite you to take a look at some beautiful artwork from children engagement programs of our 2022 Iqbal Masih Award winner, Blue Dragon Children's Foundation. So there's going to be a little slideshow as soon as I'm done talking. You will also hear music from a song competition held by our Enhanced project in Vietnam to raise awareness about child labor. The project has been working to improve the country's capacity to prevent and address child labor, including by expanding certain aspects of social protection. Please enjoy the slideshow and the music, and thank you again for joining us today.
Khi em được sinh ra, em là thiên thần nhỏ, là niềm vui cuộc sống, hạnh phúc bên gia đình, như búp non trên cành, màu xanh đầy sức sống, là thế hệ tương lai, thế giới của ngày mai. Khi em được sinh ra, em là công dân nhỏ, chăm lo cho em tình yêu thương, vui tung tăng tới trường, cùng tràng xanh ước mơ như những vườn hoa xinh rực rỡ ngàn sắc xuân. Em ước mong sao thế giới của chúng ta không trẻ em lao động, không dịch bệnh chiến tranh. Em ước mong sao thế giới của chúng ta một thế giới bình yên trên hành tinh chúng ta. Em ước mong sao thế giới của chúng ta